Hi, friends. Welcome back to True Crime Echoes. Today, we're diving into one of the strangest and darkest threads running through human history. It's a story that stretches across thousands of years, crossing cultures, religions, and even modern science. From ancient kings who surrounded themselves with eunuchs, to young boys transformed into castrati opera stars, all the way to the tragic story of Alan Turing. In the 20th century, the common thread is power control and the price of conformity. What might seem like an odd or even unbelievable subject at first, castration as a practice, actually tells us so much about who we are as people, about the lengths societies will go to enforce loyalty, purity, or even beauty. And while some of these stories sound distant, others feel chillingly close, reminding us that the past is never as far away as we think. So grab a seat, settle in, because this is going to be a journey into the shadows of history you probably never expected to hear. Chapter 1: What Makes a Eunuch? Do you ever stumble across a piece of history that makes you stop and say, wait, people really did that? That's exactly what happened to me the first time I dug into the strange, unsettling history of eunuchs. Now, I'll be honest with you, before this, the only time I ever even thought about eunuchs was in passing. Maybe you've heard the word in old history classes or in some half-remembered story about ancient emperors, or maybe even in a cult documentary like Heaven's Gate. Remember that, in the late 1990s, their leader voluntarily had himself castrated because he believed it brought him spiritual purity. At the time, I thought that was just some bizarre one-off situation, the kind of extreme thing that only shows up in the margins of history. But then I started looking deeper, and I realized this wasn't rare. In fact, it was everywhere. Across cultures, across centuries, people have chosen or been forced to give up their ability to reproduce, all in exchange for something else: power, safety, purity, or survival. So let's strip it back to the basics. What is a eunuch? The word sounds almost clinical, but the truth is far messier. At its core, a eunuch is a man who has been castrated, and that could mean a few different things depending on the time and place. Sometimes it meant just the removal of the testicles. Other times it was both the penis and testicles. In some cases, it wasn't even surgical. Ancient records tell us of men whose testicles were crushed or tied off with string until the blood flow stopped and the organs literally withered away. I know it's graphic, it's unsettling, but that's the reality of what we're talking about. And you might be asking yourself, but why? Why would anyone do this to themselves or allow it to be done to them? The answer changes depending on where you look. In some religious groups, castration was seen as a way to overcome sin. If sex was considered the ultimate temptation, then removing the possibility altogether seemed to them like the quickest way to holiness. That's what the Heaven's Gate leader believed, and he wasn't the first. In Russia, during the 1800s, there was a sect called the Skoptsi, who thought that cutting away the body's reproductive parts freed a person from sin forever. They called themselves the White Doves, and they saw castration as proof of their devotion. But religion wasn't the only motivator. In other cultures, eunuchs were actually considered highly valuable, not because they were holy, but because they were trustworthy. Think about it: if a man couldn't have children, then he had no heirs, no family line to secure, no divided loyalties. That made him, in the eyes of kings and emperors, the perfect servant. He could devote himself entirely to the throne without distraction. In ancient China and Persia, eunuchs became political advisors, guardians of the palace, and sometimes the most powerful men behind the scenes. And then there were careers that had nothing to do with politics or religion. In 16th century Italy, young boys were castrated to preserve their high-pitched voices. These boys became opera singers called castrati, whose voices could soar in ways adult men's voices never could. They were admired, adored, even turned into celebrities. But behind that fame was a brutal reality. Most of them had no choice in the matter. It's easy to assume that this was always voluntary, some kind of extreme personal decision. But the truth is, most of the time, it wasn't. Boys were forced into it by families chasing opportunity, by poverty, or by kings and rulers who wanted loyal servants. Sometimes they were kidnapped. Sometimes it was used as punishment. And once it happened, there was no going back. I remember when I first learned just how far back this went. The earliest records of eunuchs date all the way to Mesopotamia around the 21st century BC. That means this practice has been part of human society for over 4,000 years. Generations upon generations of men were shaped and broken by it. So here's the dark irony: while many eunuchs were seen as powerless, without family, without lineage, some of them ended up wielding more influence than kings themselves. They had the ruler's ear, the keys to the palace, and the secrets of the court. They were underestimated, and that made them dangerous. That's what we're going to explore in this story. Not just the gruesome details of castration itself, but the human stories behind it, the ambition, the betrayal, the tragedy. Some eunuchs became pawns, others became stars, and a few seized enough power to change the course of empires. It's strange, isn't it? On the surface, this is about something physical, something medical even. But when you peel back the layers, it's really about control. Control over the body, control over loyalty, control over society. And in the chapters ahead, you'll see exactly how that control played out from Persia to China, from the opera halls of Italy to the tragic story of Alan Turing. It's brutal, it's bizarre, and it's a part of history that most of us never learned in school. So buckle up, because once you step into this world, you start to realize that the history of eunuchs isn't just about what was taken away. It's about what was built in its place. Power, fear, music, betrayal, even love. And it all starts here with one haunting question: what does it really mean to be a eunuch? Chapter 2, Bagoa's Power in the Shadows. When I first read about eunuchs in history, I thought of them mostly as background characters. Servants in the palace, silent attendants holding fans, maybe guardians at the royal doors. But then I came across a man whose story completely flipped that image upside down. His name was Bagoas, and if you ever want proof that eunuchs weren't powerless, look no further than him. Let's set the scene. Persia, 4th century BC. This was the era of the Achaemenid Empire, one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, stretching from Egypt to India. At its head sat the king, the so-called King of Kings, surrounded by nobles, generals, and advisors. And among them, a eunuch named Bagoas quietly maneuvered his way into becoming one of the most dangerous men in the empire. Now, the thing about eunuchs in Persia is that they were everywhere in the palace. Kings kept them close, believing they were loyal, less distracted, less likely to start their own dynasties. They ran errands, managed affairs, carried secrets. Most of them were overlooked except for Bagoas. Bagoas didn't just serve, he schemed. He was the kind of man who watched everything, remembered everything, and slowly positioned himself as the king's confidant. He became the private minister to King Artaxerxes III, the man who ruled Persia at the time. And when I say private minister, I don't mean he just fetched the king's wine. No, Bagoas had his ear. He was there in the room when decisions were made. He whispered in the king's ear about politics, about alliances, about enemies. And yet behind that loyalty, Bagoas was plotting. He wasn't content with being close to power, he wanted to control it. So he made a decision that would define his legacy: he murdered the king. The details are hazy, as they often are with stories this old, but sources suggest that Bagoas poisoned Artaxerxes III, eliminating not only him, but also most of his sons. Think about that. A eunuch, supposedly a loyal servant with no family of his own, wiped out the ruling line of Persia almost in one move, and people barely saw it coming. But Bagoas didn't kill everyone. He left one son alive, Arses, a young prince who was inexperienced, pliable, and most importantly, someone Bagoas thought he could control. He placed Arses on the throne, turning the boy into a puppet king, while Bagoas pulled the strings from behind the curtain. For a while it worked. Arses listened to him, deferred to his judgment. The court whispered, of course, everyone knew who really held the power, but no one dared cross Bagoas. He had already proved that he could remove a king. Who would stop him now? But here's the thing about power: once you taste it, enough is never enough. A few years later, Bagoas decided Arses wasn't working out either. Maybe he wasn't pliable enough anymore. Maybe he started showing signs of independence. Whatever the reason, Bagoas poisoned him too. And just like that, another king was gone. With the throne now empty, Bagoas handpicked the next ruler, Darius III. And if that name rings a bell, it's because Darius was the king who eventually faced Alexander the Great. But before Alexander came into the picture, Bagoas thought he had found another puppet. Only this time he miscalculated. Darius III was not as naive as Arses. He was sharper, more suspicious. He'd seen the patterned kings dying mysteriously, Bagoas always standing right there beside them. So when Bagoas tried his old trick again, offering Darius a poisoned drink, the king turned the tables. According to the story, Darius told him, "You first." Imagine that moment, Bagoas, the man who had orchestrated the deaths of kings, suddenly trapped in his own game. He was forced to drink from the very cup he had prepared. And just like that, the poison meant for another man ended his own life. There's something almost poetic about that ending. A man who built his power on betrayal, on poison and manipulation destroyed by his own weapon. When I think about Bagoas, I don't just see the story of one eunuch. I see the bigger truth: eunuchs weren't just powerless servants. They could be kingmakers, and sometimes even king killers. They occupied this strange in-between space, denied the ability to have families, but given access to the most intimate spaces of power. That combination made them dangerous. They knew secrets they had nothing to lose, and sometimes, like Bagoas, they had ambition burning hot enough to risk everything. What makes Bagoas even more fascinating is how history remembers him. His name actually became so associated with eunuchs in Persia that many others were called by it later on. Imagine being so notorious that your name basically turns into a generic label for others like you. That's legacy dark twisted, but legacy nonetheless. And when you think about it, his story isn't that different from modern tales of people who rise by manipulation, who hide behind loyalty only to betray. The tools change today. It's not poison goblets, but backroom deals and corporate takeovers. But the human drive for power and the lengths people will go to get it hasn't really changed. For me, Bagoas's story was the first that made me realize this history isn't just about strange customs from faraway cultures. It's about ambition, corruption, and betrayal, things we still see every single day. The only difference is the costumes. And in many ways, Bagoas set the stage for the eunuchs who came after him. Because if one man could manipulate kings in Persia, what about the eunuchs who filled the Forbidden City in China, or the ones who influenced the Roman emperors? What happens when there aren't dozens of them but thousands, all holding the ear of the most powerful man in the world? That's where we're headed next. Because if Bagoas showed us what one eunuch could do, China shows us what happens when eunuchs became an entire political class. And trust me, it gets even darker. Chapter 3. The Emperor's Shadows. Eunuchs of the Forbidden City. When you think of China's Forbidden City, the first images that probably come to mind are sweeping red walls, golden rooftops, and the emperor in all his glory at the heart of the most powerful empire on earth. But hidden behind those walls was a world most people never saw, a world where power didn't always belong to the emperor or the officials dressed in silks. No, sometimes it belonged to the eunuchs. I always thought eunuchs were just silent servants, maybe fanning the emperor or guarding the harem, but the truth is so much darker. In China, eunuchs weren't just servants, they were gatekeepers to the most private, most secret parts of the emperor's life. And once they had that access, it gave them a kind of influence that no scholar or general could match. Think about it. Officials had to go through endless rituals, petitions, and ceremonies just to see the emperor. But the eunuchs, they were there in his bedchamber. They handed him his meals. They controlled the flow of letters, requests, even gossip. In many cases, the emperor only knew what the eunuchs told him. That's power not on the throne, but standing right beside it. One of the earliest and most chilling examples of this is a man named Zhao Gao. If Bagoas in Persia was dangerous, Zhao Gao makes him look like an amateur. Zhao Gao lived during the Qin dynasty, around the time China was first unified under Qin Shi Huang, the same emperor who built the first version of the Great Wall and commissioned the famous Terracotta Army. Zhao Gao wasn't just any eunuch. He was educated, cunning, and quickly rose through the palace ranks to become the emperor's close confidant and tutor to his son. Now Qin Shi Huang was a ruthless man. He burned books, buried scholars alive, and demanded absolute obedience. but even he eventually fell to death in 210 BC while traveling far from the capital. And that's where Zhao Gao saw his opportunity. The emperor's death should have been followed by a clear succession. The eldest son was supposed to take the throne, but Zhao Gao, together with a high-ranking minister, decided to interfere. They forged documents, manipulated orders, and made sure that the crown went not to the rightful heir, but to a younger, weaker son who would be easier to control. The eldest son, Zhao Gao, arranged for him to be forced into suicide. Just like that, the line of succession was broken, and the empire had a puppet emperor on the throne with Zhao Gao pulling the strings. But Zhao Gao wasn't content with being the power behind the curtain. He wanted to test just how far his control really went. And this is where one of the most famous stories in Chinese history comes in. One day, Zhao Gao brought a deer into the court and presented it to the emperor. But instead of calling it what it was, he told the emperor it was a horse. The emperor, confused, laughed nervously and said, "But that's clearly a deer." Zhao Gao insisted, "No, it's a horse." Then he turned to the other officials and asked them what they thought. Here's where it gets chilling. Some terrified of crossing. Zhao Gao agreed with him and said, "Yes, of course it's a horse." Others, braver or maybe just more honest, said, "No, that's definitely a deer." Zhao Gao took note of who said what. And not long after, those who had dared to contradict him started disappearing, executed, exiled, or silenced. From then on, no one dared oppose him. The phrase "calling a deer a horse" actually became a proverb in Chinese culture, meaning to deliberately mislead or test loyalty. And it all started with this one eunuch, flexing his control over life and death. Zhao Gao's reign of terror didn't stop there. He orchestrated purges of officials, turned the court into a nest of fear, and manipulated the emperor into disastrous decisions. His paranoia grew so great that eventually he had the emperor himself killed and replaced yet again with another puppet. By the time Zhao Gao finally met his own violent end, assassinated by the very men he tried to control, he had left the empire fractured and unstable. And honestly, his story sets the tone for centuries of what was to come. The Forbidden City would later become home to tens of thousands of eunuchs during the Ming and Qing dynasties. Imagine that tens of thousands of men who could never have families of their own dedicating their lives to serving one man, the emperor, in exchange for wealth, influence, or just survival. The system created a perfect storm. Eunuchs had no heirs, no bloodlines to pass on wealth, which meant their only hope of leaving a legacy was through power and corruption ran rampant. Some eunuchs became infamous for selling access to the emperor bribes in exchange for favors. Others grew rich off palace trade, controlling supplies of food, silks, and weapons. And the higher they climbed, the more dangerous they became. There are records of eunuchs leading armies, executing ministers, and even deciding who lived or died inside the palace walls. Of course, not every eunuch was another Zhao Gao. Some were loyal, some genuinely tried to protect their emperors, but the system itself encouraged manipulation. When you live in the shadows of absolute power, watching it every single day, but never being able to truly hold it, you start looking for cracks to slip through. And the emperors knew it. Many dynasties tried to limit eunuch power, passing laws to keep them out of politics. But the irony is, the more you try to keep them out, the more they find ways to sneak back in. Because at the end of the day, the emperor couldn't live without them. They were the ones closest to him, and in that closeness, they became indispensable. What strikes me about Zhao Gao's story, and about eunuchs in the Forbidden City in general, is how human it all feels. Strip away the silk robes, the palaces, the rituals, and what you're left with is ambition, fear, and betrayal. The same things that drive people today, in boardrooms, governments, and even families. History just dresses it up differently. For me, Zhao Gao's deer and horse test is one of those haunting little parables that sticks with you. It shows how power isn't just about armies or titles, it's about controlling reality itself. If you can make people say a deer is a horse and punish them if they don't, then you've bent truth to your will. And that's the most terrifying power of all. The eunuchs of China didn't just survive in the shadows. They thrived there, sometimes becoming the very shadows that swallowed dynasties whole. And their legacy reminds us that the closer you are to power, the more dangerous you become, not just to others, but to yourself. Because history shows us again and again the same poison you pour into someone else's cup may one day be the poison you drink yourself. Chapter 4: Rome's Silent Servants. When most of us picture ancient Rome, we think about gladiators in the Colosseum, senators in togas arguing in marble halls, or emperors reclining while being fed grapes. But what you almost never hear about are the eunuchs. And yet they were there, quietly slipping through the palaces, guarding the emperor's secrets, and sometimes whispering in his ear at the very moment decisions that shaped the empire were made. The first time I came across references to eunuchs in Rome, I was surprised. Rome always struck me as this hyper-masculine society, warriors, conquests, generals boasting about their legions. Castration seemed like the last thing Romans would accept. But here's the thing, Rome was complicated. On the one hand, yes, masculinity was celebrated. But on the other hand, Rome was an empire, and empires borrow from everywhere. They adapt, and absorb. And eunuchs were one of those imports. Eunuchs came into Rome primarily from the east, from conquered territories like Persia, from Asia Minor, and even from Egypt. They were bought, sold, and traded like property, often ending up as slaves in elite households. Roman aristocrats liked using eunuchs as personal attendants, especially in households where women were kept secluded. After all, a eunuch was seen as safe, someone who could guard the women without being tempted by them. That same twisted logic made eunuchs common in the service of wealthy wives' daughters and mistresses. But the story doesn't stop there. Over time, eunuchs started moving into the imperial palace itself, and once inside, just like in Persia and China, they gained access. Access to private chambers, access to correspondence, access to the emperor himself. One of the earliest emperors to rely on eunuchs was Elagabalus, a teenager who ruled Rome in the early 3rd century. Elagabalus is remembered as one of the most controversial emperors, lavish, eccentric, and often accused of shocking sexual behavior. He surrounded himself with eunuchs, trusting them over senators or generals. To him, they were loyal, discreet, and maybe most importantly, they had no families or political ambitions of their own. That made them, in his eyes, perfect companions. But that trust came at a cost. Eunuchs in Rome, like in so many other places, learned quickly that influence could be as valuable as gold. If you wanted a favor from the emperor, sometimes it wasn't a senator you had to bribe, it was the eunuch guarding his door. Those quiet figures in the palace corridors became power brokers, deciding who got in and who didn't. And this influence didn't end with the empire's politics. It bled into religion. By the 4th and 5th centuries, when Christianity began spreading across Rome, eunuchs were there too. In fact, some of the most trusted servants in early Christian households were eunuchs valued for their supposed purity. There are even church writings from the time debating whether castrated men could serve as priests or bishops. Some said yes because they embodied self-control. Others said no because their bodies had been altered. Either way, eunuchs were part of the conversation shaping not just political Rome, but spiritual Rome. One of the most disturbing details I came across while researching this is how young some of these eunuchs were when they were castrated. Many were just boys, sold by their families, or captured in war. Rome was brutal, and children often had no say in what happened to them. Their bodies were altered for life, and their only path forward was to serve. That reality makes all those grand marble statues and heroic stories of Rome feel much darker to me, because in the shadows of those triumphs were children whose futures had been stolen. And of course, this wasn't just about service. Like in China, eunuchs in Rome could also climb the ladder of influence. Some became indispensable advisors, some grew rich through bribes and favors, and some became so powerful that senators and generals had to bow to them. By the late empire, eunuchs were everywhere in the palace. They dressed in fine robes, carried themselves with dignity, and often held titles that made them outrank men who commanded entire legions. It drove the traditional Roman elite insane. Imagine being a battle-hardened general only to realize the emperor listened more to a quiet eunuch standing by his bedchamber than to you. And yet, emperors kept them close. Why? Because in a world where betrayal was everywhere, where assassinations happened in dining rooms and coups were launched in the middle of the night, the eunuchs had no families, no dynasties of their own. Their only loyalty, at least in theory, was to the emperor. But history shows us loyalty can always be bought. Some eunuchs betrayed their emperors, siding with rebels or plotting in the shadows. Others stayed faithful to the end. The problem is, by the time you realized which kind you had at your side, it was often too late. I think that's what makes the story of eunuchs in Rome so haunting. They weren't gladiators in the arena or senators making fiery speeches. They didn't leave behind monuments with their names carved in stone. But in their silence, in their proximity to power, they shaped the fate of emperors. They were the gatekeepers of Rome's secrets, and sometimes the silent executioners of its destiny. For me, learning this was like peeling back the curtain on a stage play. Rome always presents itself as this grand spectacle of conquest and glory. But behind that curtain, the actors who really decided who lived and who died weren't always the ones in armor or crowns. Sometimes they were the eunuchs' men whose bodies had been altered, but whose minds remained sharp, calculating, and hungry. And that, to me, is the real dark history of Rome. It wasn't just about swords and battles. It was about whispers in corridors, bribes slipped into soft hands, and the silent servants who could make or break an empire. Chapter 5: Voices of Angels, Lives of Silence. When we think about music in Italy, most of us picture opera, the sweeping arias, the velvet curtains, the passionate voices that could move entire audiences to tears. But buried in the history of opera is a story I honestly never expected to find. It's the story of the Castrati men who were castrated as boys in order to preserve their angelic, high-pitched voices. I know it sounds shocking, and it is. But for nearly 200 years, castrati weren't just part of Italian opera, they were Italian opera. They were the rock stars of their time, adored by queens, sought after by noblewomen, and celebrated across Europe. And yet behind their fame was pain that began long before they ever stepped on stage. The whole idea started in the 16th century when the Catholic Church banned women from singing in choirs. Think about that. Half the population was forbidden to raise their voices in sacred music. But church leaders still wanted that soaring, angelic sound. So instead of allowing women to sing, they came up with something far more disturbing. They turned to young boys. At first, it was just boys singing before their voices changed. But puberty always arrived, and with it came deeper voices. And so, someone history doesn't even tell us who exactly came up with a grim solution. If a boy was castrated before puberty, his voice wouldn't drop. He would grow into a man with the lungs and chest of an adult, but with the vocal range of a child. The result, a sound unlike anything else in the world. That's how castrati were born. Most of these boys came from poor families. Recruiters scouted them, the same way modern talent scouts look for singers today, except instead of offering a record deal, they offered castration. Families desperate for money or status sometimes agreed, convinced that sacrificing their child's body could bring the family fortune. Many times the boys had no say at all. They were drugged, taken to backstreet surgeons, often barbers, doubling as doctors, and left to wake up forever changed. For every boy who survived the brutal procedure, there were many who didn't. Infection, blood loss, shock medicine wasn't exactly advanced in the 1600s. Those who lived went on to years of intense training, hours of practice every day, endless rehearsals, strict diets. By the time they stepped onto the stage, they were polished, perfect performers. And when they sang, people were captivated. Castrati could hit notes higher than any tenor yet, with a strength and power no woman's voice could match. At least that's how audiences described it back then. Their voices soared through cathedrals, filling opera houses with a sound people swore came from heaven itself. That's why they were called the voices of angels. But here's the darker truth. Behind the stage lights, castrati were living very different lives. They were admired, yes, but also mocked. People whispered about their bodies, about what had been done to them. Many castrati were stuck in a strange in-between. They weren't seen as fully men, but they weren't accepted as women either. They became objects of fascination, scandal, and sometimes ridicule. One of the most famous castrati was Farinelli, born Carlo Broschi in 1705. He was castrated at the age of 12, a bit older than most, which meant he still developed into a tall, commanding figure. By his 20s, Farinelli was a sensation. Women fainted at his performances. Men praised him as the greatest singer alive. He sang for kings, for queens, for entire nations. His fame was so immense that when he performed in London, rival opera houses went bankrupt because audiences only wanted him. But fame couldn't erase what had been taken from him. Farinelli never married, never had children. His personal letters reveal loneliness, a sense of being both adored and isolated. And when his career finally ended, he retired to Spain, living out his last years quietly, far from the stages that once worshipped him. Farinelli wasn't the only one. Hundreds of castrati filled Europe's theaters. Some were rich and successful. Others faded into poverty when their voices failed, and all of them carried the same physical and emotional scars. What haunts me most is that so many of these boys never had a choice. Imagine being 8 years old, not even understanding what's about to happen, and waking up to a body that will never grow the way it's supposed to. Imagine being told this was your ticket to greatness, only to find that greatness comes with a lifetime of whispers, stares, and isolation. By the 19th century, public opinion began to shift. People started realizing how cruel the practice was. In 1878, the Pope finally banned the church from hiring new castrati. The last castrato in the Vatican choir retired in 1913. His name was Alessandro Moreschi, and thanks to early recording technology, we can still hear his voice today. When I first listened to it, it sent chills down my spine. His singing was eerie, almost otherworldly, beautiful, yes, but also unsettling, because I knew the price he had paid to sound that way. For me, the story of the castrati is one of the darkest chapters in music history. It's proof of how far people will go in the name of beauty, art, or religion. These men were worshipped on stage, but off stage, they were prisoners of decisions made for them as children. And maybe that's why their voices still haunt us. Because when you hear them, you're not just hearing music. You're hearing sacrifice. You're hearing a childhood stolen, a body altered, a life reshaped. You're hearing what happens when society values art more than humanity. The castrati are gone now, their era ended more than a century ago. But their story still lingers, reminding us that behind every voice of an angel, there may be a life silenced in other ways. Chapter 6. From Scars of the Past to Chemical Shadows. By the time the 20th century rolled around, most people believed the age of forced castration was over. The era of castrati was long gone, the courts of kings and emperors no longer filled with eunuchs whispering in the shadows. Medicine had advanced, society had moved on, or so it seemed, but the truth is the practice didn't disappear, it just changed. Instead of knives and back-alley surgeons, a new tool emerged: chemicals. What once was done with blades was now done with hormones, and the reasoning behind it was no less dark. This is where the story of Alan Turing comes in. Most people today know Turing as a genius, the man who cracked the Enigma code during World War II, helping the Allies defeat Nazi Germany. He's often called the father of modern computing. Without him, the world as we know it, computers, smartphones, artificial intelligence, might not even exist. His brilliance quite literally changed the course of history. But in his lifetime, Alan Turing wasn't treated as a hero, he was treated as a criminal. Turing was gay, and in 1950s, Britain, that was illegal. Homosexuality was considered an act of gross indecency, punishable by prison. It didn't matter that Turing had saved millions of lives. It didn't matter that his mind had altered the future of technology. What mattered to the law was who he loved. In 1952, after reporting a burglary at his home, Turing's relationship with another man was discovered. Instead of helping him, the police charged him with gross indecency. At his trial, he didn't deny it. He refused to be ashamed of who he was. But the punishment that followed was devastating. The court gave him a choice: prison or chemical castration. Now, chemical castration sounds clinical, even sterile, but don't be fooled by the name. It meant being forced onto a regimen of synthetic hormones, estrogen injections meant to suppress his sex drive. In theory, it was supposed to cure him of his so-called indecency. In reality, it destroyed his body and his spirit. The side effects were brutal. His libido vanished, but so did his sense of identity. The hormones caused his body to change in ways he didn't choose. He grew breasts. His physical health declined, and he became deeply depressed. For a man whose mind had always soared above ordinary limits, being trapped in a body, altered against his will, must have felt like the cruelest prison. And it wasn't just his body that was punished. His career was shattered. Because of his conviction, Turing's security clearance was revoked. The government he had once served turned its back on him, barring him from the work that defined his life. Imagine giving everything to your country only to be told you were no longer trusted, no longer useful because of who you loved. In 1954, just 2 years after his sentencing, Alan Turing was found dead in his home. The official story is that he ate an apple laced with cyanide, an act of despair. He was only 41 years old. Some people believe it was suicide. Others whisper that perhaps it wasn't, that maybe the government wanted him silenced. We'll probably never know for sure. But either way, his death was the final act of a tragedy that began not on the battlefield, not in the world of code breaking, but in a courtroom that criminalized love. For me, what makes Turing's story so haunting is how familiar it feels when set against the backdrop of history. For thousands of years, men were castrated in the name of loyalty, purity, or art. Turing was castrated chemically, not surgically, in the name of law and morality. The tools changed, but the cruelty was the same. It's a reminder that progress is not always linear. We like to think of ourselves as more enlightened than the people of the past, but sometimes the same shadows just take on new forms. Turing's legacy, though, didn't die with him. Decades later, his contributions were finally recognized. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth granted him a posthumous royal pardon, an apology that came far too late, but at least acknowledged the injustice he endured. And today, Turing's face even appears on the $50 banknote in the UK. His name is taught in schools, his brilliance celebrated worldwide. But even as we honor him, we can't ignore the darker part of his story. Because Alan Turing wasn't just a mathematician, or a war hero, or the father of computers. He was also a victim, one of the countless people who suffered under laws and practices that treated human lives as disposable in the pursuit of control. And when I think about that, I can't help but see the thread running through history. From the eunuchs of Mesopotamia to the castrati of Italy, from boys taken by imperial recruiters in China to a genius sitting in a British courtroom, the reasons might differ, but the cruelty feels the same. The question that lingers is, what will future generations say about us? What practices today will they look back on with the same horror, the same disbelief that we feel when we hear about forced castration? Alan Turing's story is not just history, it's a warning. A reminder that brilliance can be silenced, that humanity can be erased not by enemies abroad, but by the prejudices of our own society. And maybe that's the darkest truth of all. Chapter 7. Lessons Written in Scars. When I step back and look at everything we've talked about, from ancient eunuchs serving kings to Italian castrati, filling opera houses to Alan Turing facing chemical castration in the 20th century, I see more than just separate stories. I see a pattern. A thread of history woven together by the same recurring theme: control. Because at its heart, that's what castration has always been about. Not just the body, but control over people's lives, their choices, their futures. In Mesopotamia, eunuchs were created to serve the palace without distraction. In China, they were molded into political tools trusted by emperors, but feared by everyone else. In Europe, poor boys were cut for the sake of sacred music and opera. And in modern Britain, a brilliant man was chemically castrated for the simple fact that he dared to love. It's painful to say, but history tells us this truth. Society has often been willing to sacrifice individuals in order to maintain systems of power. And yet history also shows us something else change. Slow, uneven, sometimes painfully delayed, but real change. Today, chemical castration is still used in some places, but now it's often framed as a treatment for sex offenders. In some countries, it's even voluntary, chosen as an alternative to prison time. But even this raises difficult questions. Where do we draw the line between justice and cruelty, between accountability and punishment that strips away human dignity? The legacy of castration also lingers in how we think about gender sexuality and power. For centuries, eunuchs were seen as less than men, as outsiders. Castrati were admired on stage but mocked off it. Alan Turing was destroyed because society couldn't accept him as he was. These echoes still shape the way we talk about masculinity, about queerness, about who gets to belong and who doesn't. I think that's why stories like these matter, because they remind us that laws, traditions, and cultural norms aren't just abstract ideas. They have real lasting impacts on people's lives. They can lift someone to power or destroy them completely. Take the story of Zhao Gao in China, the eunuch who became so powerful he could control the emperor's court. Or Farinelli, who sang his way into the hearts of millions, but died without the life he might have chosen for himself. Or Alan Turing, whose mind reshaped the world, but whose heart was broken by the very country he saved. Each of these men reminds us of the same haunting lesson: brilliance, talent, even loyalty, aren't always enough to protect you when society decides you don't fit its rules. But there's another lesson here, too. Even in the darkest histories, legacies survive. Farinelli's voice captured in stories and music still inspires awe. Alan Turing's name now appears on Britain's currency, his genius finally recognized for what it was. And the last eunuch of China, Sun Yaoding, lived until 1996, long enough to tell his story to historians, so it wouldn't be forgotten. These voices, once silenced, now speak across time. They remind us not only of what was lost, but also of what must never be repeated. And when I think about the future, I wonder, how will people look back on us? Will they say we learned from history, or will they shake their heads at the injustices we still allow? Because let's be honest, the urge to control, to reshape, to dominate it hasn't gone away. It just takes on new forms. Whether it's in medicine, in law, or in culture, there's always a danger that we value systems more than the individuals inside them. So maybe the real takeaway from all of this is not just to remember the past, but to act differently in the present, to ask harder questions about what justice really means, to think about how power is used and who pays the price for it. For me, that's what makes the dark history of eunuchs, castrati, and chemical castration more than just a grim curiosity. It's a mirror, a reminder that cruelty often hides behind noble words: purity, loyalty, morality, even justice. And unless we recognize that, we risk repeating the same mistakes under new names. At the end of the day, history isn't just about what happened long ago, it's about the choices we make now. And the scars left on bodies and lives across centuries should push us to make different ones. Because if there's one thing I've learned from diving into this story, it's this: the darkest history isn't behind us, it's the one we fail to prevent in the future. And that brings us to the end of this story. From ancient palaces to opera houses, from secret cults to modern courtrooms, the history of castration shows us how societies have tried to shape people's bodies and lives to fit their own needs. Sometimes it created king's advisors, sometimes celebrities, sometimes tragedies, but almost always it left scars, physical, emotional, or both. Looking back, it's easy to feel shocked, even horrified, by what was done in the name of purity, loyalty, or morality. But history's darkest lessons only matter if we pay attention to them. If anything, these stories remind us to question the systems around us, to ask who pays the price for the rules we accept, and to make sure that future generations don't look back on our own time with the same disbelief. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Echoes for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, what shocked you most about today's episode. Leave me a comment down below, and let's talk about it. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, history always has echoes.